What if I told you that the phone in your pocket, the cars on your street, and even the electricity lighting your room all depend on Africa's soil? Would you believe me? Africa holds about 30% of the world known mineral reserve, and yet Africa produces less than 3% of the global manufactured goods. That simple contrast already tells a powerful story. Today, Western countries talk about electric cars, green energy, artificial intelligence, and digital economies. But behind every one of those shiny promises are minerals dug from Africa ground. Yet, Africa is being described mainly as poor or in need of foreign aid. If Africa is so poor, why does the richest part of the world depend so heavily on African resources? If the West is moving towards green energy, why is Africa becoming even more important? And if Africa is so behind, why are global powers competing quietly for influence on the continent of Africa? That is the question every right-thinking person needs to start asking. So in this video, I won't give you slogans or emotional speeches. I will show you the facts, the numbers, and the real connection between Africa and the global economy from an African point of view, not CNN or BBC point of view. And by the end of this video, those three questions will have very clear answers. Africa is not just another supplier in the world economy. Africa holds about 30% of the world-known mineral reserve, according to geological surveys. You can go and verify this information yourself. That is nearly 1/3 of everything the modern industry will need to function. Yet, Africa's role in global manufacturing is less than 3%. Africa provides raw materials, but rarely controls the final products. Take cobalt as a simple example. More than 70% of the world cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Cobalt is a core ingredient in lithium-ion batteries, which power your smartphone, laptops, and electric cars all over the world. So when someone in Europe or America talks about clean energy or electric vehicles, they are quietly talking about minerals dug from Congolese soil. Tesla and the entire EV industry cannot do without cobalt from Congo. One would think Congolese will be living like kings and queens, but the opposite is the case. Same pattern repeats with other minerals. South Africa produces about 70% of the world platinum, which is used in cars and in hydrogen energy system. Zambia is one of Africa's top copper producers, and copper is essential for carrying electricity, so the electric industry cannot do without copper. Guinea supplies over 25% of the world bauxite, the raw material for aluminium used in airplanes, packaging of products and materials, and even in the construction industry. These are structural contributions to modern life. Africa, no doubt, is blessed beyond measure. Now, compare Africa with Europe. Europe has advanced factories, powerful companies, and advanced technology, but Europe has very limited mineral reserves. Africa has vast wealth but limited industrial capacity. So one side has the raw material and the other side has the machine. That is why Africa and the West are tied together in ways many people don't openly discuss. So here is where it becomes interesting. Africa is often described in global media as a continent of poverty and aid, yet the world's richest industry depends heavily on Africa's soil. They try to condition our mind to believe we are the ones that need help, whereas they are the ones that cannot do without our mineral resources. Africa is not poor because it lacks resources. Africa is poor because it does not control enough of the value created from those resources. Most African minerals leave the continent in raw form. They are processed, refined, turned into product elsewhere, and then sold back to us at much higher prices. Africa earns little for what it provides, while others earn much more for what they build. So this is why Africa can be both extremely resource-rich and economically struggling at the same time. It is not because Africa has nothing. It is because Africa does not yet fully owns what it has. Let that sink. Africa does not fully owns what it has. And until Africa gain more control over what comes out of its ground, the world will continue to quietly run on African soil, while Africa itself remains on the sideline of the wealth it creates. Let's talk about technology, because this is where Africa's importance becomes impossible to ignore. A single smartphone contains over 60 different minerals. This includes cobalt, copper, lithium, gold, and rare earth elements. A modern electric car contains even more. In fact, according to the International Energy Agency, an electric vehicle requires about 6 times more mineral input than a traditional petrol car. Here is a key question. Where do many of these minerals come from? Cobalt comes mainly from Congo, copper comes from Zambia and the Congo. Lithium is increasingly coming from Zimbabwe and Namibia. Platinum comes mostly from South Africa. Manganese, used in steel and batteries, is heavily mined in Gabon and South Africa. So when people talk about the future being digital and electric, Africa is not outside the future. Africa is a major supplier of it. That future cannot do without Africa. But here is what most people don't notice. Western tech companies design products in places like California, Germany, or South Korea, but the physical material that made those products comes largely from the ground of Africa. Without those materials, these designs remain ideas on paper. They can never come to life. That is why whenever there is political instability in a major mining country, global markets react almost immediately. So when production slows in Congo or Zambia, battery prices are definitely going to go up in Asia, Europe, and even America. So that is not a coincidence. It is a connection, because that is where those raw materials are coming from. So let's compare that with another region. Japan is one of the most advanced technology countries in the world, yet it has very limited natural mineral resources. So Japan imports nearly all its critical minerals. Africa, on the other hand, has the mineral resources but lack the factories. One side builds factories, the other side supplies the minerals. This imbalance is what keeps Africa independent and keeps others powerful and richer. Demand for critical minerals is rising very fast. The International Energy Agency estimates that demand for lithium could grow by 40 times by 2040, and cobalt demand could rise nearly 25 times. That means Africa's role in global technology is not shrinking, it is expanding. Yet Africa still exports most of this mineral in raw form, while batteries, electric cars, and electronics are made elsewhere. This is why Africa remains a supplier, not a leader in the technology space, despite being essential to it. So when we say without Africa, Western technology will slow down, we are not exaggerating. We are stating the facts, not just a fact, but a structural fact. Africa is not just participating in the digital age, Africa is running it, even if it is rarely credited for it. The real issue is whether Africa will one day build as much technology as it supplies and consumes. Here is one of the most uncomfortable truths about Africa's place in the world economy. Africa feeds global industries but often struggles to feed its own industries. Let's look at oil first. Nigeria is one of Africa's largest oil producers, exporting over 1.3 million barrels of oil per day in recent years. Yet for decades, Nigeria has imported much of its refined fuel because it lacks enough functioning refineries. Nigeria does not have any functioning refineries, exception of the Dangote refinery. That means Nigeria sold crude oil cheaply and bought petrol and diesel back at higher price. Now let's talk about bauxite. Guinea is the world's second largest producer of bauxite, the raw material for aluminium, but Guinea does not produce much aluminium itself. The bauxite is shipped to Europe and Asia, processed there, and then sold back to African market as finished aluminium products. The same story repeats with gold, copper, cocoa, and cobalt. Ghana export gold, but import most of its finished jewelries. Ivory Coast export cocoa, but earn only about 5 to 7% of the final value of a chocolate bar. Congo export cobalt, but import batteries. This pattern is not accidental. It is the result of how the global economy has been structured for decades. African countries were shaped to extract and export raw materials while processing, branding, and manufacturing were done elsewhere. To put it simply, Africa sell cheap, others sell expensive. Now, compare Africa with East Asia. Countries like South Korea and China were also exporters of raw material and low-value goods, but over time they invested heavily in manufacturing and technology. Today, China still imports African minerals, but China exports finished products to the rest of the world. Africa, on the other hand, is still largely stuck at the bottom of the value chain. In 2024, Africa's total merchandise trade, including import and export, reached about $1.5 trillion, while European Union alone exported roughly $2.8 trillion worth of goods. Now, this gap isn't because Africa lacks resources. It is because Africa often exports raw materials, while Europe, on the other hand, export processed goods and finished products. When Western countries speak about economic partnership with Africa, it is important to ask, partnership in what role? Because as long as Africa only supplies raw materials, Africa will remain economically weak. This is why Africa can be central to global industry and still struggle with poverty and unemployment at home. Africa is feeding global industry, but our own local industry is starving, dormant, and even non-existent. So until that changes, Africa will remain powerful in potential, but limited in power. People think Africa will become less important as the world moves away from oil and gas. That assumption is misleading. Truth is, Africa is becoming even more crucial, not less. The world is shifting to green energy. Electric cars, solar panels, wind turbines, and batteries. These technologies need minerals. They need a lot of minerals from Africa. Minerals like lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, manganese, and rare earths. Zimbabwe and Namibia have some of the largest lithium reserves in the world. Lithium is essential for batteries in electric cars, laptop, and that smartphone you're watching this video with. According to the International Energy Agency, global demand for lithium could increase over 40 times by 2040. So without African lithium, this green transition will slow drastically. That is just the truth, and there is nothing anybody can do about it. Copper is another mineral resources on the list. Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo are a major producer. Copper is used in electricity transmission, solar panels, and wind turbines. So no copper, no modern electricity grid. No copper, no renewable infrastructure. Even rare earth crucial for wind turbine, high-tech electronic, and defense system are found in Africa. South Africa, Burundi, and Madagascar are blessed with rare earth minerals. Here is the point: green energy shift does not reduce Africa's role. It even increases the role of Africa. Oil was once the West's main energy dependency. Now, minerals and metals are taking its place, and Africa holds a significant share of these minerals. So the mineral needed for batteries, solar panels, and wind turbines make Africa strategically central to the global economy of the future. Yet, as with oil, Africa risks remaining the raw material supplier while others captures the high-end value. Many African countries export minerals in raw form, while Europe, China, and the US manufacture finished products like batteries, electric vehicles, and solar equipment from them. With strategic planning, investment in local processing, and industrial development, Africa could capture more of this emerging energy economy. That is the truth. So we need leaders that will be able to implement all these things. So instead of exporting raw lithium or cobalt, Africa countries could produce batteries, electric cars, or renewable energy systems themselves. So that would change the game, not just for Africa, but for the entire world. In short, Africa is no longer just oil-rich or resource-rich. Africa is becoming green mineral-rich, and the West depends on this more than most people realize. While the West talk about moving beyond fossil fuel, it will continue leaning on Africa, just in a different form. So the West talked about moving beyond fossil fuel, it will continue leaning on Africa, just in a different form. African minerals are now the foundation of the green future, making the continent more strategic than ever before. Raw minerals are not just about money, they are about power, and that is where African mineral intersects with global security. Take uranium, for example. Niger supplies a significant portion of the uranium used by France's nuclear power plant. Without Nigerian uranium, French electricity could be disrupted, affecting both homes, hospitals, and factories. Rare earth elements are another example. These minerals are essential in military technologies, satellites, drones, and missiles. African countries like South Africa, Burundi, and Madagascar are important sources of this mineral. So if access to this mineral were disrupted, military technology in the West could slow down or become more expensive. Even oil and gas from Africa remain vital. Nigeria and Angola are major oil suppliers, supporting not just European and US industry, but also military and transportation systems. This is why Western governments often act quickly when there is political instability in regions rich in resources in Africa. Military bases, diplomatic missions, and even foreign intervention are sometimes motivated by the need to secure access to critical minerals and energy in Africa. Africa is in many ways a chessboard of global power. So whoever controls access to its resources gains leverage in energy, technology, and military strengths. For the West, Africa is not optional. It is a strategic asset. Losing access to key minerals could have cascading effect on the global economy and military systems. Africa could use this leverage to strengthen its own security, economic interdependence, and regional stability. By controlling exports, investing in processing, and negotiating fair partnerships, Africa could turn its resources into tools for self-reliance instead of dependency. So the West may appear dominant, but in reality, it relies heavily on African soil. And that is a fact that is rarely discussed in mainstream media. For decades, the West had almost uncontested influence over African resources. Europe, America, and a few other Western countries control trade, investment, and mining assets. Africa exports raw materials cheaply, and the West builds high-value industry elsewhere. Then China arrived and changed the rules. China invested heavily in Africa, not only in mining but also in infrastructure. China offered loans, technology, and trade agreements, often in exchange for access to raw materials in Africa. By 2021, China had become Africa's largest trading partner, with trade exceeding $250 billion. So this includes iron, copper, cobalt, lithium, and oil. Russia also increased its footprint, particularly in gold, uranium, and the energy sector. Together, these two countries created competition for Western dominance in Africa. Suddenly, the West could no longer assume Africa would remain, exclusively under its influence. Africa now had options as well. Countries could negotiate better deals, demand local processing, or even favor one partner over another. Africa's bargaining power was growing quietly but significantly. So these shifts forced Western countries to rethink their approach. Africa could no longer be treated solely as a source of cheap raw material as it used to back then. The conversation now included partnership, strategic alliances, and long-term agreements. Aid and investment became tools of diplomacy and access, rather than purely altruistic efforts on the part of the Western world. The rise of China and Russia also highlight a large truth. African raw materials are among the most valuable in the world. Whoever controls African resources, or at least maintains strong partnership, gains a significant advantage in global trade, technology, and not only in technology but in geopolitics and as well. Africa is a player. The world superpower are competing to secure access to its soil, its minerals, and its future markets. For Africa, this is an opportunity. Strategic investment, local processing, and smart partnership could transform resources into real economic power. The continent could move from being a supplier of raw materials to being a builder of industries, wealth, and influence at the same time. And for the West, it is a wake-up call. Africa cannot be ignored. Africa is not just rich in minerals and raw material, it is rich in people. And this is a part of the story that is often overlooked when the world talks about Africa. By 2050, Africa is expected to have about 2.5 billion people, which will be roughly 1 out of every 4 persons on Earth. Compare that with Europe, whose population is aging and shrinking. So this demographic difference is significant. Why does this matter for the West? It matters because raw material alone aren't enough. To fully use minerals, a workforce, infrastructure, and consumer base are needed. Africa offers all these three. That is why global companies are increasingly looking at Africa not just as a supplier of raw materials, but as a market and source of talents. Take smartphone, for example. African mobile market is growing faster than anywhere else in the world. In 2026, more than 650 million Africans are expected to own a smartphone. That's a massive market for technology companies, and it makes Africa both a consumer and a supplier at the same time. Now, think about labor. Africa's young population is a future workforce for industries that require skilled and semi-skilled labor. So countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and Egypt are investing in education and technology training programs to prepare their youths for jobs in manufacturing, renewable energy, and digital services. Companies are not just buying minerals, they are investing in the continent's future. However, the challenge is clear. Africa must prepare its population to fully benefit from these opportunities. Education, infrastructure, industrial development, and governance will determine whether Africa remains a supplier or become a producer, builder, and decision maker. African youth is one of its most valuable resources. Minerals make the continent strategically important today, but people make it powerful tomorrow and forever. Countries that control both will have a unique advantage in the global economy. Africa is not a continent to watch passively. It is a continent whose resources and people will shape the 21st century. And the West, along with other global powers, know this, which is why competition for influence is intensifying every day. African population, combined with its mineral, makes it not just necessary for West, but central to global industry, security, and growth. And this combination is only growing stronger. For decades, African resources were undervalued. Minerals were extracted cheaply, but this is slowly changing. African governments are starting to recognize the value of their resources, not just as export, but as drivers of industrialization, wealth creation, and economic interdependence. Take gold, for example. Ghana has restricted the export of raw gold to encourage local refining. Lithium is being processed domestically in Zimbabwe rather than leaving the country as a raw material. Namibia has announced plans to develop local processing facilities for several key minerals. They signal a shift towards capturing more value within the continent. This shift has consequences. Global power are paying crucial attention. Contracts are being renegotiated, investments are being structured differently, and competition for access is intensifying every day. Africa is no longer a passive supplier, it is becoming a strategic player. Africa's potential to process, manufacture, and control resources threatens the traditional model of dependency. The West, China, and other global powers now understand that Africa is not just important, Africa has leverage. The transformation is not automatic, it depends on governance, infrastructure, and investment in local industry. Without these, Africa risks repeating past patterns. The undervaluation of African resources is ending, but the next decade will determine whether Africa remains primarily a supplier or becomes a producer